history and culture around the associations with the devil. And so the first thing I want to do is deal with kind of the elephants in the room. Who in the room has heard this idea that Robert Johnson gained his guitar skills by going down to the crossroads at midnight one night and somehow selling his soul to the devil?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty good lore.
Yeah, it's pretty common knowledge, at least if you're familiar with the blues. There is no actual evidence that that has any basis in reality. Now, what's interesting to go into...
I got you.
Thank you. What's interesting to go into is... I'm just going to hand these to you.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
What is interesting to go into is where that myth might have come from. And it comes from a lot of different parts. So, it's interesting to note that the Mississippi Tourism Board is actually propagating this myth. If you drive into Mississippi, like there are certain places where if you cross the border, there will be a picture of some guy with a guitar sitting at the crossroads in the middle of a field. And Mississippi has actually designated a particular intersection of highways that didn't exist when Robert Johnson was alive as the crossroads, right? There's a lot you can say about that. That's a bit of a tangent, so I'm not going to go into it too much. So there are a lot of pieces that I want to look at, and I found this fascinating because this kind of gives you a taste for how different partial truths can come together to create a myth that on its whole is not true. So Robert Johnson did sing songs called Hellhound on My Trail and Me and the Devil Blues. Like, those are really the only two songs that he sang that involved the devil directly. If you actually listen to those, it's questionable whether he's talking about the literal devil, and I will get into that later on. So that might be one reason why it got associated with Robert Johnson. Another thing is that the story of Robert Johnson kind of goes that he was a very mediocre player, and then he kind of went away for a couple of months, and all of a sudden he came back and he was fantastic. So they were looking for a reason for that. Another reason is, frankly, that the old blues guys very quickly learned what kind of, that these kinds of sensational myths, it's the same thing we see with our media today, right? A myth about, this guy went away and practiced really hard for a couple months, came back really good. That is much less interesting than, hey, this guy sold his soul to the devil, right? And so if you listen to a lot of these old lectures, you can get a taste for is any of this true, or are they just kind of playing in and oh yeah, this is what happened. So the idea of selling one's soul to the devil for all kinds of reasons does show up in a lot of oral folklore. There's a resource by Harry Middleton Hyatt called Hoodoo Conjuration, Witchcraft, and Root Work that goes in, in this book you can look up all kinds of myths. There's an entire entry in the index for selling one's soul to the devil. And for all kinds of reasons, right? And skill in instruments is one of those things. Never in Mississippi. There's New Jersey, there's South Carolina, there's all kinds of other places. Never Mississippi, right? And usually not guitar. In fact, more often it's the accordion. Why anyone would sell their soul to the devil to get to play the accordion, I don't know, but it's in there. And it's really interesting to look at the variations on how the soul gets sold. Like sometimes it's a temporary deal. The devil owns it for 7 years and then you get it back. It's bizarre. All of these wives' tales get generated, and all these myths they exist in every culture. Another interesting tidbit to note is that in the Yoruba tradition, there was an idea of crossroad deities. So Elegua was in the Santeria Yoruba tradition, Elegua, there was a different kind of incarnation of the, I am not super clear on all of this because it depends on which variation of. There are a number of different hoodoo style religions that are related to the original Yoruba African religion. But the idea is that there's a great quote that I found online from a guy named Dr. Reverend E, who's a Santeria priest. And he said, Elegua knows everything, witnesses everything, and has the key to changing our destinies as humans. He is the one that can speak for all of the other Orishas, gods, because he knows everything that's going on, right? So this is the idea of a road takes you somewhere. And so this deity was more than just kind of a roadway, like a physical roadway that you're going to walk on. He represented rivers, it was a very cultural idea of something going somewhere, and there being a god that is aware of and follows and perhaps even controls that flow along that path. But then there actually is a myth of a blues man selling his soul to the devil for skill in guitar. It's not Robert Johnson. Tommy Johnson used to play with his brother Liddell Johnson. And I think I have it spelled wrong in the handout if you care. It's capital E, lowercase, capital L, lowercase e, capital D, E-L-L. So if you want to change that on your handout, apologize for the misspelling. So Tommy Johnson and Liddell Johnson used to play together, and and Liddell ended up in the ministry. Like, he reformed and became a preacher. And after all of this, came back and said, yeah, my brother sold his soul to the devil. Blues people, like people who are in the culture of the blues and not necessarily preacher-type people, kind of look askance at that and say, are you really going to believe a reformed blues man who became a preacher about this? Like, he's just trying to denigrate the blues. So take that as you will. The quote that I have on that is, Johnson learned to play guitar from his older brother Liddell, and as a young teen ran away to the Delta. He returned 2 years later an accomplished performer. So there's all these stories about middling performers running off, gaining skill, and coming back. Somebody's going to look for an explanation. The one that actually, these guys were not related to Robert Johnson. Which according to Liddell, Johnson attributed his skill to a meeting with a mysterious figure at the crossroads. The story, which involved Johnson handing over his guitar to a large black man who tuned it for him, predates the similar and more famous tale of the unrelated bluesman Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil at the crossroads. So, I find that interesting because there's all these little pieces of myth that have come together to create this idea that Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads. Which, as far as the history is concerned, and in every book that I have read, is basically entirely discredited and says this has no basis in reality. The man just worked really hard and learned to play guitar. So, taking care of the elephant in the room, I'd now like to talk about the devil as a metaphor. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that when the blues in general talks about the devil, and you can see this in Johnson's 2 songs where he talks about the devil, it's a metaphor for something else. This is not, the idea of metaphor in music is not something that's exclusive to blues. So it's something that I would imagine most of you can pretty readily understand. So first of all, there's this idea of presencing in the blues. And you've got all these songs that go, I'm bad, or I'm so evil, or I'm, talking about violence and talking about all the women that you've got spread out all over the South, or whatever it is. You've got these inflated egos and people trying to establish themselves as people to be reckoned with. I think I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail later, but I mean, if you understand where the blues came from, that's a really understandable thing to do. Right? The blues exists as a form of ventilation for a culture that was oppressed. Right? And it started out in slavery, and it was it was very contained under slavery. With the end of slavery, like, all of these hopes had been built up around the end of slavery, that that was going to be it, and then the problem would be taken care of. And in some ways, it actually got worse. I'm going to get into that in a little bit. I am trying to keep track of time. And so it was really important for these people who have been dehumanized for their entire lives and as an entire culture. Like, you have to understand, there were academic papers coming out at this time trying to justify black people as subhuman. Like, it was messed up. But you had to have some kind of a justification if you were going to enslave an entire group of people. And so, if you're in that context, right, it becomes incredibly important to assert that humanity and to assert that self-importance and personality. And that came out in the blues. Now, it also became important to speak out against the oppression that you're dealing with, but you can't do that in the South, right? There's a wonderful, Blues in the Mississippi Night is a recording by Alan Lomax. He got 3 really well-known blues performers. It's on YouTube. He got 3 really well-known performers off into a recording studio, and they had just a really frank conversation. And Mississippi Fred McDowell said, I've known guys that just wanted to cuss out the boss, and he was afraid to go up to his face and tell him what he wanted to tell him, and I've heard him sing those things, sing those words, you know? Back to the boss. Just be behind the wagon hooking up the horses or something, the mules or something, and he'd go to singing and sing things to the horse. Make like the mule stepped on his foot and say, get off my foot. There's an expletive. Or something like that, you know. And he meant he was talking to the boss. Right? So if you frame it in the context of, oh, I was just talking to my mule, you can say whatever the heck you want to your mule, and the boss doesn't care. And the boss doesn't have to know that you just got to vent about your frustration with the boss. Right? The song 7 Long Years, I worked like a slave. Right? That ostensibly is about the woman who just kicked you out of your house, or her house. A lot of people think that that was really about the man that he had worked for 7 years and thought that he had a good thing going, and just put him off to the side around this, because there's more to that culture and that understanding that I think is important to note. But there's this idea of presencing in the blues, and I think that it's pretty clear where it comes from. So Robert Johnson's song "Me and the Devil" blues, I can play it. What it talks about is it's one of Robert Johnson really didn't have a lot of songs, but in this song he's talking about a knock comes on his door, and there's the devil at the door, and he's just like, "Hey, devil, let's just go walking down the road." And he goes walking down the road with the devil, like side by side. He's not like brought along against his will. He's not being forced to do it. He's walking side by side with the devil, and then he's singing about, I'm going to beat my woman till I get satisfied, and my old evil spirit can take the Greyhound bus and ride. Like, are you going to mess with a guy who walks side by side with the devil? Like, there's very much an idea of presencing here. Elijah Wald, in that book right there, Escaping the Delta, if you want to know about Robert Johnson, that's an excellent book. Like, he goes into the whole story of Robert Johnson, and then he breaks down every song that Robert Johnson sang, and every recording of it in great detail. It's fascinating from both a historical perspective and a musical perspective. But he says the idea that violence, mayhem, death, and misery are fertile soil for humor is common among poor people throughout the world, and frequently inexplicable to those who are cushioned from the harsher and earthier aspects of life by money and formal education. Right? So, my guess is, and I would hope, that nobody in this room has experienced discrimination at the level that Robert Johnson probably would have experienced in the South. But I think one reason that everybody can connect to the blues is like, let's leave aside any kind of comparison of level of grief. My guess is everybody in this room has experienced grief at some level, pain at some level, right? And you can understand seeking solace in making a joke out of it, right? I do it all the time. Like, if I'm having a really sucky day, I'll make it into a joke, and it helps me move on, right? And there's a lot of that going on in the blues. You can see it a lot of times. So, there's the idea of presencing. There's also the idea of the devil as the boss. I already talked about that, so I'm going to move on. And then more generally, there's the idea of the devil as the white man, right? So white versus black. Everybody in this room has had some level of history, knows that the end of slavery was not the end of the struggle for civil rights. Yes. Is this news to anyone? Okay, good. Just checking. So another Robert Johnson song. Oh no, I'll just do this one. So this is Peter Wheatstraw. This is a song called Devil's Son-in-Law. And out of he had dozens of albums, and I think all but 2 of them, he was credited on there as the Devil's Son. Right? So think about that. Who is the devil to a black man in the South? Like the very present devil.
White folks.
White folks. Right? And I'm not trying to demonize all white folks. But in general, whether you were complicit and silent about it, or whether you were one of the people who was installing separate fountains for colored people and poisoning them, which was the other end of the spectrum, that became the identity. This is a racial thing, white versus black. Very understandable. So that's the devil. Who's the devil's son-in-law?
That kid is bossing you.
Okay. What makes somebody somebody's son-in-law?
Marriage.
You marry the devil's daughter. What was the cause of more lynchings than anything else in the South?
Rape of white women.
Not even rape. Look at them funny.
Yeah.
Alleged.
Alleged.
Be more accurate.
Sure. Right? So he's talking about he married this is not an association with the devil. This is an undercutting. This is a rebellion. P.D. Wheatstraw, the guy who sang that song, apparently was Honey Boy Edwards reported that he used to walk down the street in St. Louis with a white woman on his arm and a little white dog on a chain every day. I'm gonna let you take from that what you will. But so there's all kinds of black cultural myths. John the Conqueror is one of them. He was a great folk hero to African American culture. John the Conqueror married the devil's son. He stole the devil's daughter from him. I can't actually remember whether they got married. Another song. This is the other Robert Johnson song that I mentioned. Hellhound on My Trail. Again, this one's a little bit different. This one you get the sense of somebody who's hunted and being pursued. Is anybody not familiar with the vagrancy laws that exist in the South? This is not, I don't think that this is something that's as well studied in middle school history, which is where most of us learn about this kind of history. Yeah. So the idea behind vagrancy laws was there were all these laws that black people can't be out after a certain time of night. Or they can't just be wandering the streets during working hours. If they're wandering the streets, and this is messed up, if they were wandering the streets during working hours, they would be arrested for it, and their punishment was to be sent to go work in some guy's cotton field. Slavery by another name. So if you listen to blues songs and know this kind of history, you hear about the guys who would hide in a house all day long. Who had a woman they would hide in their house all day long and come out clean at the end of the day, like they had worked in the fields and gone out and gone home and gotten showered, and then they could go out and play and make their living. But they were stuck inside all day because otherwise they would run afoul of these vagrancy laws. So one idea of an interpretation of this song is that the idea of the devil is it's those vagrancy laws, and it's this structure of control, wanting to take the black man and make him work, or chasing him down and he's trying to get away and avoid him. And then there's this other idea of the devil as the world. And this is a little bit different. This doesn't necessarily associate with the Reconstruction South and civil rights. There's a bunch of other songs that use the devil as a personification of sin, and use the devil as a personification of evil and being tempted by it. So Clara Smith has a song called "Done Sold My Soul to the Devil," which is probably about as obvious a reference to association with the devil as the myths that we're thinking about as exists. This is generally thought to be a story about prostitution. Clara Smith was one of the early blues women, and they were generally based out of some kind of a city and would go on these train tours and give their performances. And this is the thought here is that the devil is a pimp who, when she gets to town, he tempts her with prosperity. I mean, this is the same. You can hear this song today. This still happens, right? Sex trafficking is en route to become the biggest illicit industry in the world right now. It's in the next couple of years, it's looking to eclipse the drug trade. Human trafficking is horrific. We had a dancer in Pensacola who vanished, and we think that that's what happened. Like, this is a real thing. If you listen to the song, she's talking about getting money and getting influence and getting power and getting a life, but her heart's turned to stone. It's messed her up, and ultimately she's unsatisfied. There's another song called "The Devil Dance Blues" by Sippy Wallace. What you need to know about Sippy Wallace is Sippy Wallace's parents were good Christian folk. They were church folk. And they were not entirely thrilled when she decided that she was going to go to the city and sing for a living. And this is a song about having a dream about going to a ball that's put on by the devil and his wife. And the idea here is, I mean, it's a very lavish ball, it's a very nice ball, but there's overtones of evil to it. Right? It's put on by the devil and the devil's wife. So the idea here is that this is a song about the seductions of the secular world, right? Dancing and partying in a great hall, and on its face it looks great, but ultimately it's put on by the devil and his wife, and ultimately it's terrifying. If you have social anxiety, you probably understand this better than the rest of us. I need to move on. So there's the. Oh man, I do need to move on. So blues music embraces evil and opposes the church is an idea that is pretty pervasive. First thing you need to know, John Michael Spencer, I can't remember what the book is, but he said white blues critics make the mistake of thinking that there's some large divide between church people and godless blues people. And in reality, there's a spectrum just like any other group. Right? So keep that in mind. Now, we can talk about the extremes because the extremes are useful for illustration and discussion. But just like any community you're a part of, you know that there are nuances of understanding. You know that there's a spectrum. You know that there's a middle ground. So always keep that in mind. Alan Lomax talks about 4 different generations growing up in the Delta, the Mississippi Delta, which is kind of known as the birthplace of the blues. The first generation was the pioneer generation. They floated down the river, and they cut the trees and cleared the land and established communities there. What you need to know about them is that they were not particularly religious. They were focused on getting things established and creating a society. They played fiddles, they played banjos, and they were just kind of like country folk. Behind them came the railroad generation, and they were the institution builders. They were the people who built the churches. They were the people who built the businesses. They were the people who created a culture and not just a loose amalgamation of people who happened to live in the same place. They basically looked on the pioneer generation as unredeemable and backward. But backward in the sense of like, we are the holy people, we are the civilized people, they're just set in their ways. After that came the automobile generation, and the ability to move and the freedom of transportation that the automobile offered exposed people to a lot more things than they otherwise would have been exposed to. And it opened up the world. But there still kind of tended to be this tie to the church, but you started to get people pulled off in other directions. But it was really the generation of the young moderns that kind of solidified that break with the church, is that these people started running off to the city, running off to and there started to be more divisions between the older generations and the newer generations. There was a lot of liberalism, there was a lot of rebellion against parents. This is not something that was exclusive to the black community by any stretch of the imagination, right? We all know about the hippie movements and stuff in the 60s and 70s, like children have always rebelled against parents and this was just, in terms of the black community, it took this particular form. Another thing to know is a lot of blues singers and artists rebelled out of a church family. The list of blues singers and performers whose parents were disapproving actual members of the clergy or deacons in their churches or got lectures from people in the family is staggering. I don't have it in front of me, and it would not be a good use of time to try to read the whole thing, but it's really long. A good example is John Lee Hooker. John Lee Hooker's father was a pastor, and a roving blues man came in town, had an affair with his wife, stole the pastor's wife. Right? It's one thing if some guy's wife gets stolen by a blues man. It's kind of a different thing if the pastor's wife gets stolen by a blues man. And then John Lee decided to go live with them. So very literally, his father had his entire life taken away by a roving blues band. So you can guess that he was not super excited when his son decided that he was going to play the blues. Son House started out a preacher and then found the drink and took up blues. Like the story goes that he heard blues and he was like, I gotta play me that. And just a year later, he's shooting people and ends up in Parchment Farm. Like, it was a quick fall. His later songs, like, use church imagery to make sexual innuendos. Like, it got really bad. But if you listen to interviews with him, like, he felt a lot of guilt about it. And when he talks about the devil, he, like, points at his genitals. And it's about that idea of temptation and being pulled away. Like, he wrestled with those demons for his entire life. So there's a lot of ties to the church, and there's a lot of rebellion straight from the church. As much of that as there is, though, there are a lot of blues singers who maintained a tie to the church, and whose songs feature Christian themes heavily. Charlie Patton was a preacher and would actually break into during his performances, was known to break into entire sections of spirituals. And he was just such a good performer that these people who came to listen to like Hokum Blues and stuff would still sit there and listen. Like, I don't know enough about Charlie Patton to know if like that was his idea of running a church or if that was just something that he was super passionate about. But that was something he did. Mississippi John Hurt has like my favorite version of Nearer My God to Thee that I have ever heard. I have to play it for you guys. Their entire albums, like Sister Rosetta Tharpe has an album called The Gospel of the Blues. The Heart and Soul of Etta James is all gospel. Where is it? Don't You See How This World Made a Change by Blind Willie McTell. Cyril Neville, who's a more modern example, has a song that I really love to dance called Don't Move My Mountain. And I'm now in a place that I can find these more easily. This is Nearer My God to Thee. So, as much as there is a separation from the church, there's also plenty of people who use the blues in a church context. There's still Christian blues being made. I have yet to, like, unless you go in the blues search, go to blues and search for gospel, don't go to Christian music and search for blues. Because if you go to Christian music and search for blues, it's going to be white. And I don't know a better adjective to describe it, but it is white. I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. And this is Don't Move My Mountain, which I'm just going to share with you because I love it. But it is like, it's very clearly a song about gospel sensibilities. And like, the key chorus is, Lord, you don't have to move my mountain, just give me the strength to climb it. right? Anyway, I'm going to move on and talk about the history of the blues in the church. I'm just going to let this play in the background because I love it. So, like I told you, John Michael Spencer, there's a spectrum. I am going to talk about the extremes and use them to be illustrative because I think that it's helpful to talk about how the division between the blues and the church developed. Please be aware, as I talk about this, those extremes are not representative of all people. They are representative of a spectrum that's getting pulled out. So, under slavery, I lied. I'm going to stop this because it's distracting. It makes me want to get up. So, I talked about slavery. When slavery was a thing, there was this hope that first of all, there was a common enemy, right? Slavery was clearly the institution that was the problem, and the solution was to get rid of slavery. So all the slaves were united in saying, that's the thing we want to get rid of. And that made for a very clear and common enemy. So there were all of these hopes wrapped up in the end of slavery. This idea of 40 acres and a mule, that you would have a livelihood, that the end of slavery meant equal rights, that suddenly black people would be the same as white people, and that there would be equal treatment. Under slavery, church was a refuge. Generally in the South, the black church was the place that they were given the most leniency to do what they wanted to do. That was the only place that they could really sing freely, because drums in Africa were used for communication and used for war. And the white people knew this, and so they saw drums and drum circles as a threat. But if they're in church, it's okay, right? So that's why you see dancing in church. That's why you see exuberance in church. Like that, it's ventilation. Blues music is ventilation. And
why was it safe in church comparatively?
Because it was devoted to God,
Okay.
and because and we're in the buckle of Bible Belt, right? One of the justifications that was used for slavery was, we're going to Christianize these heathen savages. And if you think that they are a lesser life form, you can very quickly justify to yourself that this is a charity that you are doing, especially if you are providing them a school. So one thing that I would like to acknowledge, right, spectrum, not every plantation on the South was what you see in Hallmark movies, right? When you bought a slave, it was an investment. You're not going to take your horse and beat them to death. Like, that's just a bad business decision. So, yes, there were cruel slave masters, and yes, there were those who did that because they could afford to, and they were just vindictive and spiteful and didn't think anything of it. But there were a lot more of them that really did think that this was the best thing, right? They thought, oh, we're rescuing these poor. You still see this. You still see people go into third world communities and say, oh my gosh, these poor lost people, we need to bring them our culture, and that will make everything better, right? It's incredibly arrogant. It is incredibly shallow, but it happens. And it can come from a very well-meaning place. So I just want to acknowledge that for you. It doesn't make it any less wrong. So the church was a refuge, and there was this idea of salvation in the church, and the people of Israel became a metaphor for the black community in a lot of ways. Right? They were going to cross the Jordan and get to the promised land. The promised land was not Israel, and it was not heaven. It was the north, where the black people were free. And there are people who would tell you that outright, like even back then. An interesting thing to note is that the major period of time in which many slaves were really converted to Christianity was the Second Great Awakening in the 1820s. And that was where some seeds of division really began to get sown in the black community specifically, because you had those who clung to their roots and the African roots and the African religions and things that came over here. And then you had the people who really did get sold on Christianity and who really did buy into the gospel. And that began to be a distinction between these groups of people. But everyone was still united against slavery. The roots of blues music, by the way, came about at the same time as all of these people from different tribes that in Africa would have been warring were now thrown together and as a matter of survival had to get along. And so they started mixing their influences, their musical influences, and that started creating something new, which became the blues. So like I said, Reconstruction in some ways was worse. I gave you the little pithy little phrase. All those hopes that had been built up were dashed. Suddenly they were not a capital investment anymore, they were replaceable. Did I? Oh, I didn't say the quote. There was a quote back right after the end of the Civil War, and it was, kill a mule, buy another. Kill a black person, hire another. Think about that for a second. If I kill my mule, I have to go out and buy another mule. If I kill a black person working on my farm, I can just go hire another one. Right? Economically, there's no loss to me. It's just a wage. And I don't care whether I'm paying the wage to this person or that person. So in a lot of ways, the incentives to protect them went away. And some things got worse. Now the two things that didn't get worse, the two freedoms that were actually delivered on were relationships. They had control over the relationships that they had, and they had control over travel. They no longer needed their master's permission to travel. So that's why you see those two themes come up in the blues so often, is because those were the two real expressions of freedom that they had. The other interesting thing is, now you start to see, so I told you about the divisions that started to exist in the black community. Now this started to take the form of people taking different approaches to addressing the problems of inequality and social oppression. So, whereas before the problem was clear, it was slavery, get rid of slavery. Now the problem is, how do I get somebody, as somebody said last night to me, how do I get somebody to like me? How do I get somebody to treat me equally? And that's a much more complicated problem. Still was the central social nexus of the black community. Keep that in mind. And blues music, this is where it really starts to become what we call blues. It still doesn't sound much like the modern blues that we listen to. It still sounds very country to our sensibilities. But this is where it started to actually be called blues. And it started to, it again took on that form of ventilation. It starts to express the ethos of the community. So then there started to become some cultural shifts. And two really good books that illustrate this are Blues People by Leroy Jones and Jukin by Katrina Hazard-Gordon. And the authors, so the split kind of really started to take form in terms of the black community. One group kind of said, well, what we need to do is we need to adapt to this culture and follow the rules of this culture and show that we can compete. And that's how we're going to earn their respect, and that's how we're going to earn equality. Right? And so that's where you got the black middle class. That's where you got people who were starting businesses and establishing their own clubs and carving out a space for themselves. How much they were accepted by the white community varied from place to place. And it was also typified by church-going blacks, for what it's worth, right? Which kind of makes sense. If you're already buying into one institution of the culture that you're coming into, if you've already bought into the church, and one idea in the church is very peace-loving and kind of wanting to do your thing and love each other and pursue reconciliation and peace through that, that makes a lot of sense. There was another group that wanted to embrace a uniquely black identity and really reinforce that under segregation, right? So if you have, it created an echo chamber, and by splitting that off in a lot of very systematic ways, you kind of created, it exacerbated that idea of creating a separate culture. A lot of the blues music came out of that because it started to reach back to the African roots, and it started to reach back to Africa to find that identity and that unique identity. So you start pulling back into African rhythms and musical elements. So blacks were fighting for an equal place in society, and there were multiple paths that people were taking, down on the other. So the people who were pursuing, like the business builders and the educated people and the people who were creating something for themselves, looked down on the people. They looked down on the people who were saying we're going to create an African identity, basically saying, no, we are in a new place. We are in an existing culture. You're just idiots in rebellion. You need to buckle up and make a name for yourselves and like be responsible members of society. And the people who were reaching back to Africa tended to be lower class because they're not kind of following the path for success in this culture, and they looked down on kind of the integrationists, I guess you could call them, as sellouts. And they said, you're trying to achieve, you are striving for something that you can never achieve, and you're turncoats to your own African culture. A lot of that became related to the church. The people who were reaching back to Africa tended to rebel against the church. Yeah.
That's basically like at least what I associate that kind of thing with the phrase respectability politics. Is that basically what that's talking about?
I think that respectability politics is kind of a loaded term.
Fair enough, yeah.
And I'm trying to really take a middle ground on this, and like I think that both, there's a lot to say for both of those, both in the positive and the negative. And again, there's a spectrum, right? Like there were all kinds of people in the church who still wanted to retain a unique black identity, but still say, we're going to try to achieve success by the path that's before us.
Sure.
And then there were plenty of people in the black community who loved blues music and wanted to live in this African establishment, but would happily pursue success in the record industry if given an opportunity. And there were those who did. Some of it was really exploitative, by the way. If you read some of these books, like there's all kinds of stories about record executives, bringing somebody into a hotel room, recording some stuff, paying them $15 and sending them home. And it was kind of messed up. I want to talk about reasons that the church rejected the blues and reasons that the blues rejected the church. So the first reason that a lot of church people have problems. Okay, so actually the first thing that I want to acknowledge is an argument about war of cultures that's advanced by Adam Gusso, who I mentioned in the first thing. And my problem, Adam Gusso has 2 hour-long lectures on the devil and the blues that are very well researched, but are flawed in that they only show one side of the research. He assumes from the get-go that he never includes a Christian perspective in anything that he talks about. And so he assumes from the beginning that the Christian perspective on this was disingenuous, and that the reason that Christian people give for being opposed to the blues is not the real reason. His argument is that it was about money, and it was about power, and it was about sex. So his argument was basically both the preacher man and the blues man wanted the money of the people in the town. They wanted to sleep around, but the blues man could be open about it, and it increased his social capital, whereas it made the preacher a hypocrite. And so the preacher was bitter about this. Now, I'm not going to say that the church is free of people who abuse the position of the pulpit. It happens. It still happens today. It's unfortunate, and I'm a Christian, by the way, in case you don't know, just to acknowledge my biases outright. It exists. We try to police it from inside. Like, sometimes it gets into the secular media. I don't understand why it gets into the secular media, but sometimes you'll hear about a pastor who's been ousted from a church because he, ran off with somebody's wife or something. That's how we try to police it. It's like, we aren't going to sit around and have a pastor who is a hypocrite. You just try not to do that. So that is true. I highly doubt that it is reflective of all pastors everywhere. Another thing to note is I am not a pastor. I know many other Christians who are not pastors. And one reason that I wanted to give this lecture here in the Buckle of the Bible Belt is, and this is probably the wrong audience for this, there are Christians in this town that I know of who swing dance, who will not blues dance because of this very issue. I hear expressions of shock. I totally understand it. And about every year, I stop and assess whether I want to continue being a part of this community.
But you mean because of the content of the music, they won't dance?
Oh, because of the content of the music, because of the culture that it reflects, because of all the trappings that come with it, right? Like I heard somebody said last night that the most important thing to know about them as a blues dancer was what kind of alcohol they liked. Right? I see varying reactions out at you all. Some of you are like, what? And some of you are like, yeah. Right?
I just think that's a very open thing to admit about yourself.
It is.
And calling that part of your culture, like.
Well, but here, if you listen to the music is reflective of the culture that it comes out of. And if you walk in blues circles for any amount of time, you will know that there is a subset of this community that is hard drinking, that doesn't mind a one-night stand, that indulges in a lot of things, and this is exactly what I'm about to get at.
And that
So-
could be said of a lot of cultures, not just blues.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. But Christians will generally question their involvement in those communities as well. So there's this idea of a war of cultures, but like I said, there are a lot of Christians who don't have, so in terms of financial stake, Adam Gusso was talking to a blues man at some point and tried to ask him this question, like, why is the church so opposed? And he apparently got cut off. Like, before he even finished the question, this guy says, before the preacher gets a chance to get his hands on that dollar, the blues man has had 2 chances at it. Friday night and Saturday night. Right? And the argument there is it's all about money. Okay. I ain't trying to sleep with anybody's wife. I don't get any of the money that goes to my church. In fact, I give money to my church. So I don't have either of those stakes. The other Christians that I talk to who avoid the blues because it makes them uncomfortable as a Christian don't have those stakes in it. That can't be the whole reason. That's some of the other reasons. And these are the reasons that Christians will explicitly give you. First of all, there's explicit glamorization of sin, whether you're talking about music or culture. Right? And you can understand the roots of it all you want, but if it's being normalized in the culture, the Christian mentality is like we need to be on our guard or just avoid it entirely. To give you some verses, Philippians 4:8. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. I would imagine that a lot of you are bringing to mind blues songs that you know and love that don't necessarily fit there. Right? 1 Corinthians 6:9. Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals. Matthew 15:19. For out of the heart come evil things, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, slanders. Right? All of those things are in blues songs. All of those things are part of this presencing culture, are part of this of what gets sung about and what gets normalized and what gets glorified in the blues. And we can talk about it as ventilation. Right? And ventilation has a place. Right? Like how many of you when you get frustrated are like, oh, I just want to hit him. Or I just want to, punch a wall or something, right? You're not a violent person necessarily. You're not actually going to go punch the guy.
Most likely.
But hopefully. But just getting to say it and get it off your chest can be really helpful. And there are a lot of people who argue that blues music, when it says, I'm so evil, I'm going to go kill that guy. Or, I sleep with all these women, blah, 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 blah. Like, there's no actual intention there. They argue that it's just pure ventilation and just an expression and just a figurative expression. And maybe for some performers it is. It's not. For all performers, we know this because we know their life stories. Right? Son House. And then there's a cultural association of the blues and the atmosphere of the blues, right? Like if you look at juke joints at all, oh my goodness. If you look at juke joints at all, they were hotbeds of violence and sex. Like, really bad in some places. There's a quote, when I was a girl, I didn't go into town and stay out all night. Mother's just not raising the girls right, allowing girls to smoke cigarettes, ride automobiles, drink, and do everything. And the church don't say nothing about it. These younger folks calling themselves having a good time. They drinks whiskey, they gambles, and they goes to town. They want to go to town to raise all kinds of devilment. And you know there ain't very much right in our cities now. There used to be special places to raise the devil, now a whole city. They got a class now they call the New Rising Devil class. Okay, I've got to move on, I got 5 minutes. So reasons that the blues rejected the church. So first of all, there was an aspect of practicality and livelihood. I think that this is not as much the case anymore since Christian media has been made into like a commercial thing. But B.B. King, the king of the blues, started out in gospel. And looking back on that for the Washington Post, he said, people would request a gospel song and would always be very polite to me, King recalled, in 1999. And they'd say, son, you're mighty good. Keep it up. You're going to be great one day. But they never put anything in the hat. When he played the blues, though, people would give him a little money or beer. And on at least one occasion, King recalled singing a spiritual song, changing the words, my Lord, to my baby, and getting a tip and a free beer. Right?
It's like
If
Sister Act all over.
If somebody's trying, in reverse.
It is Sister Act. My guy to my God. Like,
Yeah.
it's the same principle.
I think Cartman did the opposite thing.
Yes, I have watched South Park. And he said, now you know why I'm a blues singer, right? If you're trying to make a living, it's great to be doing the Lord's work and all, but you got to pay the bills at some point. And if that's what you got, if what you got is playing on the sidewalk, you're going to prioritize playing what pays. Actually, that's worth knowing. There's a long history of these traveling bluesmen who, all indications are that their repertoires were a lot larger than we know. They were playing for money, they would play whatever paid. And so they could play country, they could play pop, they could play whatever. They only got paid to record blues music for race records. The blues also, people who played the blues also tended to reject the moral Manichaeanism of the church. The church says there is good and there is evil. All these people reaching back to African religions, to borrow a Western philosophical phrase, there was this idea of the synthesis of good and evil. Everything's a little bit good and a little bit evil, and everything's a mix. If you're buying into that, you're not necessarily going to buy into this division that the church has. Kalam ya salam. Life is not about good versus evil, it's about good and evil eaten off the same plate. There's a book called Mystery Train. There's a really interesting quote that's hugely controversial in it, but I'm going to share it with you guys anyway. The blues singers accepted the dread but refused the piety regarding the Puritan revival and the Great Awakening. They sang as if their understanding of the devil was strong enough to force a belief in God out of their lives. So I think I'm going to use the last minute to take questions. We'll just do that.
If you guys are okay with going 5 minutes into your break, we can spend 5 minutes on questions. We okay with that?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you want to leave.
Get out of here.
The title of the new Conjuration book where you go to New Jersey and sell your soul.
Okay. That is Hoodoo, Conjuration, Witchcraft, Root Work by Harry Middleton Hite.
Okay. And then my other question was, did you run into any examples of the crossroads myth where he meets with someone who is not the devil?
did I run into any examples of the crossroads myth in which he ran into somebody other than the devil? I didn't do a tremendous amount of research into the crossroads myths. So I did not, but that's not to say that they don't exist.
Yeah, I've heard of various other.
Where he's just like a mysterious stranger
Yeah.
or some.
Oh,
I've
yeah.
heard of.
Yes.
But where he's not necessarily evil.
Well, so there's the mysterious stranger thing, or like the generic, some black man came and did thing. There's usually like this overtone that he's something supernatural, and generally something evil. But yeah, not necessarily the devil. That does exist.
Continuing with the crossroads discussion, to what degree do you think prolific recording artists, to what degree do you think people put these myths on the people that they were hearing on the radio versus these other people that were lesser known?
Oh, to what extent do I think that people heard a myth and then just associated with a famous person because they were familiar with the famous person? I would imagine that that's exactly what happened with Robert Johnson, right? Tommy Johnson was an influential blues player, but he was not at the level of Robert. Well, Robert Johnson kind of gets overinflated in the blues revival in terms of the level of influence that he had, which is an entirely other discussion. I don't know exactly when that myth got associated with Robert Johnson. So if it was associated with Robert Johnson, like Tommy Johnson may have been more influential than Robert Johnson. Like Robert Johnson's influence is hugely controversial. Like you can read entire books that argue he was so important, and then other entire books that are like he was nothing.
In his time versus revivalists.
Exactly, in his time. So if that myth was applied during the revival, I would imagine it's very likely that what happened is somebody heard that myth, heard Tommy Johnson, and said Robert Johnson in their brain because Robert Johnson was super familiar with that. I mean, my guess is that that's exactly what happened with Liddell Johnson, is that you heard some part of one of these myths about selling your soul at the crossroads, and it became, first of all, as a preacher, a really useful tool for, oh, that blues people, he sold his soul to the devil. And it was also like a really easy thing to just pick up from the folklore and adapt. That's why I think it's interesting to go back and look at, okay, here's this piece, and here's this piece, and there's this piece, and here's this piece. Like that's how all kinds of stories are built. Is you take pieces of other stories and craft them into something yourself.
I know you and I have argued about this, but that's called historical context.
We're not going to go into that.
I think
We good?
Any other questions?